This is a download from BFM 89.9, the business station.
Karen says crying is not an easy emotion to suppress. This is about the story that we're going to be talking about, whether crying at work is all right. And Karen says, I think that shouting rather than crying should not be allowed.
I'm really looking forward to discussing this topic, and I'd like to hear people's responses. And I know what you're saying there, Karen, and I don't think I've ever cried at work.
I certainly have, but I've not felt comfortable with it ever. So I have cried at work, but it's usually, excusing oneself and going to seek out a quiet corner, which, by the way, in our new office does not exist. We have, for some reason, decided to go with the whole glass and mirror aesthetic. So really all you're doing is hiding in a corner where people can watch you cry while you turn away.
And I've always operated in the arts and in media, and it's a very emotional kind of landscape. And so if someone does cry, it's never been an issue. But I think that if you work in a much more corporate landscape, which can often be very male-dominated,
yes, then
a woman can be held against a woman, and if a man starts crying, then I don't know, it can be held even more.
I don't know if it would be held against someone necessarily if they've been conducting themselves in a very typically masculine way for a very long period of time to suddenly cry. It's like, oh, we got behind the wall.
Oh, right, okay.
Isn't that lovely?
Yeah.
But when a woman cries, I think it is almost always perceived as an act of manipulation.
Oh,
which is just
really?
one of... Yes, I do think that there are many people who believe that if you cry in the midst of a heated conversation, that it is a gambit almost, it is an act to just kind of cut the conversation short, because what are you going to say to a crying person? But that's where we're coming from with the story, because according to a 2018 survey of 1,000 adults in the US workplace, at least 45% of American workers have cried at work. But whether or not, so then there's that other question about whether we do need to start normalizing it, whether if you're asking people, hey, you need to be passionate about your work, you need to care about it. If we're going to use that kind of emotional language when we're trying to motivate people, then perhaps we need to start accepting that if you're going to try and get people emotional at work, that other things will come along with it.
Is this in the same category as allowing people to nap at work? I say this because
I have... Really?
I'm asking because crying, napping, kind of almost childish actions which we're supposed to have grown out of and become mature, that we should actually allow that broader range of emotional activity. And that, say, napping is the same kind of thing. Because if you nap, you might not want to cry. It might help you through that difficult moment. I mean, just you're overtired and everything,
I think napping is less involuntary than crying, though.
Okay,
there is that.
No, what I'm saying is that there's this whole set of emotions beyond the kind of like the rigid, very, very male emotions that are allowed, accepted in the working place. And we should be thinking that all sorts of things should be allowable.
And a range of actions, I think, associated with those emotions, right? Which is why we're talking about things like napping, like crying. So we have organizational psychologist Hetal Doshi for her thoughts on this. Thank you so much for joining us. So, okay, we've been asking people, I'll ask you as well, do you think that crying should be completely normalized at the workplace?
I think crying is basically a display of an emotion, and I think any display of emotion or any emotion and display of emotion may or may not be normalized, but should definitely be understood. Everyone should be able to understand how best to deal with this emotion and any other display of emotion.
Well, following on from that, what are the perceptions people have of crying at the workplace?
I'm not sure. I don't think there have been any perceptional studies done specifically on crying within Malaysia and Malaysian companies. But generally speaking, it is not a collective idea or reputation. It is a very individualistic pathway that I think people have taken as leaders. Some are completely fine with it. They've normalized it for themselves, and in fact, they see it as an opportunity Some of them, quite frankly, don't know what to do with it. They think it's okay, but they don't know what to do with it. And then some, on the other hand, think it's a total no-no and that everybody should be, very, I guess, I won't even use professional, but non-emotional at work. That it should just be a transactional moment between an employee and performance where there's no display of emotion.
So how can the different parties involved, mainly employers and employees, use moments of emotion or conflict to identify potential problems in the workplace? How do you make the most of it and learn from it when someone has just expressed an emotion?
Yeah, I think it's a huge opportunity, actually, whenever emotions are expressed. It's a huge opportunity to understand what is the story behind it. There is a lot of hope when a person expresses any kind of emotion. It actually comes across as, I am hoping that something will be done with this expression. So time and psychological safety is a very important notion in this particular event. And I think, unfortunately, most leaders are not necessarily equipped because they themselves feel threatened in that situation and they themselves want to take action to protect themselves in this situation more than figuring out how they can leverage on this as an opportunity to build a relationship and build performance as well. And I think that's the part where most leaders will begin to become quite fidgety, especially if it's a opposite gendered party. So if the leader is, for example, male and the subordinate is female, or vice versa, it becomes very, very uncomfortable because we are not, most of the time we express the highest of our crying emotion to someone of a similar gender. So with the opposite gender, it becomes very, very challenging. So most of the time what happens is that when you're uncomfortable with that, you tend to just distract yourself or try and distract the person by getting tissue or by getting water or by saying, hey, let's reconvene again at another time. But once you ignore that emotion or block it or distract it, the next time around when you try and evoke it again, it's not going to come out to the same capacity.
So how can you ensure that you're handling the situation tactfully and fruitfully when a colleague cries and not just be like, here's your tissue, as you mentioned?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think the first acknowledgement should be to say thank you for feeling that you could express yourself over here, and inviting or allowing respect for that particular emotion, and then saying, where do you think this is actually coming from? Where is this coming from? So trying to peel the onion slowly. In psychology, we always call it peeling the onion, meaning not moving at all to solution, just peeling the onion, like where is this coming from? How long have you been experiencing it for? Why has it taken you so long to come and express it this way? What is your hope in your expression to me? But as you peel the onion, it's important to know that you are allowing for data to present itself. What is all the data behind this particular emotion? What is the story behind it? But it doesn't mean that just because somebody cried that you have to do something about it. You can still kind of push it back to the person to decide after you've presented the story, what do you want to do? So giving the person back the power rather than as a leader feeling intimidated and then thinking that you now have to do something about it. So just like how somebody gets angry or how somebody gets upset through a cry, it's really an opportunity to allow the person to express themselves fully so that they can understand it and you can understand it. But it's just as important to allow a process of empowerment so that the person can redirect themselves rather than you direct the person or you redirect yourself for that person.
So is there a difference in how people perceive outbursts of emotion in the workplace? For example, raising one's voice, banging a table, for that matter, crying, when it comes to male and female colleagues?
I think that is already, there's a lot of research to say that yes, it is more acceptable for men to be aggressive and display aggressive emotions than for females. And the perceptual differences has already been, there's so many studies that say that it's normal and is accepted when a male shows aggressive display of emotions versus a female. And likewise, it is normal and also probably accepted when a female displays more of a softer or vulnerable display of their emotions rather than a male. However, sometimes when men display softer or more vulnerable emotions, they're actually perceived to be in a better light as well. So, example, if a male leader tears, they would say he's very empathetic. So there is some advantage actually when a male leader or a male employee displays more vulnerable emotion. They tend to at times also be considered in a better light than a female who displays a vulnerable emotion. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and it's common for people to apologize for their tears after the fact. Does this contradict the idea that crying at work is an expression of emotion that should be understood?
I think it really depends on whether you have caused any intentional harm through your cry. So if you have intentionally harmed somebody through crying, because crying can also involve words after that. So words may be exchanged, statements may be made. So if you have in the process hurt somebody through your tears, it may be just as valuable as any other expression to acknowledge how your actions may have hurt somebody. However, if you have teared and you have not harmed the other person, and there is really no need to apologize, then there is no need to apologize. You are merely trying to express yourself. But what you can do is to probably just say thank you for making it feel safe for me to be able to be in a vulnerable space with you. I really appreciated that.
How ready are Malaysian companies to be able to deal with these situations? Are there cultural barriers that we still need to overcome?
Yeah, look, I think I don't think it is a Malaysian thing. I think it's an individual thing. I've seen many leaders over here who are very empathetic, very compassionate, and also very able to deal with situations like this. And I think it's through all of their experience of going through certain type of training with regard to leading people. At the same time, I do notice that there are many leaders who are totally not upskilled to be able to handle things like this. So I don't think this is a central piece of what an organization, like crying, for example, I don't think it's a central piece in their aspiration, the ability to handle crying. But I think the ability to be able to lead and the ability to lead people means the ability to lead emotions. I don't think there's any cultural barriers whatsoever. I think there is just your own ability to deeply understand the power of emotions. In fact, Asian cultures, typically, if you want to look at it from an Asian perspective, are generally known to be the more emotive culture, the one that is very in tune with expressing and wanting to hear and to be heard as well. So that's a very natural Asian kind of a collectivist culture. I don't think, if anything, I think the culture over here could be more of an advantage than a disadvantage with regards to the ability to address emotions skillfully.
Hetal, thank you so much for joining us. We've been speaking with organizational psychologist Hetal Doshi for her thoughts on crying and the workplace. So we've been asking you as well, what do you make of this? Have you cried at the workplace? Do you think it's something that should be normalized? You can let us know. Call 7733 2900, WhatsApp 018-789-8899, tweet us at BFM Radio.
I have a question to ask you, Lynn.
Oh.
Is this a male-female? This is a male-female thing, isn't it? I mean, this is as in
clarify your question.
As in, more often than not, it'll be if anybody is going to cry in the office, it'll be a woman as opposed to a man. One, because men, I don't know, just don't necessarily cry quite so much.
Men have been socialized not to cry.
Socialized not to cry. Okay, thank you.
Also, I think physiologically we have shallower tear ducts.
Oh, really?
Apparently. It might be an urban myth. You can correct me if I'm wrong. But yeah, apparently.
All right, fine,
yeah.
Fair enough.
And not just defending my fellow criers.
Right. So if if the situation is where it is a man and a woman, and they're discussing, a work situation, they're discussing something very important in the office, and if the woman then starts to become emotional and shed a tear, what should I do? What should I do as a male?
Well,
how should I?
I think it all comes down to one word, Cam. Are you ready?
Oh, go on.
Yeah, it's going to change your life, I think.
All right.
Just listen. It really is all it takes. I think people assume that there's a big song and dance that needs to be done because it feels as if crying is such a big expression of emotion. When more often than not, at least in my experience, crying usually happens just as a physical response to feeling overwhelmed. I have cried out of happiness. I have cried out of shock. I have cried from sadness. I've cried from anger. Not all in the workplace, mind you. But that has been a reaction. So it isn't always to do with anger at you or any particular situation. So sometimes you just need to sit tight, hang in there, and listen for a little bit, and it will pass, and you will still be able to have a productive conversation.
Because I save my tears for really important things, like watching Parent Trap for the 10th time.
Yeah, I've seen it. I've seen it happen. It's quite a sight to behold. We have some messages that have come through, including this from Kay, who says, if bosses are allowed to scold you, why should staff not be able to cry in response? And then we have a message from Shireen who says, I've unfortunately done it a few times, mostly around the time my mother was battling leukemia. She was in Ipoh, I was in KL. When she passed, I would cry every now and then at work because I work in the medical industry and a lot of things I would see would hit close to home. I've also cried because of a difficult manager, just once and only when venting to colleagues. Crying isn't always easy to control for emotional people.
Yeah, and I'm listening.
Excellent work, Cam. Dr. Jag says, I had the misfortune of seeing my previous HOD cry to a patient when she had to break the news of terminal cancer. It ended up in a scene where the patient was consoling the doctor, telling the doctor it's okay. I just felt that was a perfect example of when it's not okay to cry. Doctor's empathy is important, but not to the point where it portrays vulnerability or weakness as a doctor. It's a tough one, but that's why medical professionalism is so important for doctors, and it's just my personal opinion.
Wow.
And I entirely agree, actually. But that's just a human thing. It's not appropriate, I think, generally speaking, to have a terminal cancer patient being forced to console you. Well, I mean, it's worse when you're their doctor, but I think in any situation, it's really not the role of the cancer patient to have to do that.
No, absolutely. But the doctor may have had to give this bad news many, many times and has just had enough. Mm-hmm. There's a breaking point for everyone.
Perhaps. And you can cry in the workplace, but perhaps not in front of the patient. So I think there are these things that play in. Yeah. Kamar Nizam says, if crying's allowed, then swearing and showing anger should be allowed too. It's emotion too, right? It's all about showing emotion. Some even laugh out loud. If people only show their emotions by crying, then the drama queens and princes will win big.
Well, I kind of agree up to a point, except that actually the swearing and showing anger and stuff generally is acceptable.
Yes, and also I come back to that point about it being voluntary or not. There's this assumption feeding in here that people want to cry, or that crying is something, that can be switched on and off. And at least in my experience, like I said, when the tears come, it's usually in the moment when I want to cry least. Nobody really wants to be crying in the workplace. Nobody wants to be crying in an argument. And it happens because I'm overwhelmed. It's not usually like, all right, Lynn, switch it on now, win this moment. It doesn't feel like that.
Well, I in my previous life, I've been a film director, and I have faked anger, and it works. It really gets me what I want.
Now we're definitely in a male-female thing, just to say.
But you just got to listen. That's all.
I know.
Listen to my anger.
Thank you. I'm listening because I accept advice. All right. We are going to be headed to the 7:30 news, after which it is going to be Skip Intro, where we're talking about Game of Thrones today. So weigh in on your favorite theories and episodes. Let us know what they are. You can WhatsApp us 018-789-8899. We will be reading them. And in the meantime, it's the news.
Thank you for listening to this podcast. To find more great interviews, go to bfm.my, BFM 89.9, the business station.